I'm here today um, on the first day of the Longevity Docs Can Summit, where we have some great topics that we're reviewing. I apologize for the sound because my mic's broke. That's fine. We will do our best. So I'm going to try and say it close enough to you without being too crazy, just to get you enough sound. Here we are in Cannes, France. So the first morning is a very interesting morning where Dr. Eric Verdin for the Buck Institute on Aging introduced his Center for Phenomic Medicine. So lots of stuff to go over. I'm going to try and go through it quickly before the small group wraps up here on biomarkers. Three big takeaways from this morning. The first has to do with Dr. Eric Verdin and the Phenomic Institute, which is being championed by Leroy Hood. And if anyone knows who Lee Hood is, if you don't know who Lee Hood is, let me tell you. So Lee Hood is a systems biologist that really inspired me to study longevity, genetics, genomics, and something called personalized medicine back in 2004. And what he was a big champion of is not just the genome by itself, but looking at the phenome. What's the phenome? The phenome is, put simply, what the heck happened here? So I'll figure this out for you guys. So the phenome is your expression in the environment relative to your genomic constraints. And so why do I think the phenome is important? Well, the phenome is biomarkers. The phenome is physical measurements. The phenome is being able to look at all of these data points and have predictive value. And one of the most important things that Dr. Verdin talked about in regards to neuroscience is that aging and the phenome of aging is 93% lifestyle. 93%. So our biggest bang for our buck is in lifestyle modification. That's great. There are certain things that work if you cannot exercise. If you cannot exercise, if you cannot stimulate things like mitochondrial biogenesis. I think of peptides like MOD-SC that can help with this. Dr. Verdin did not talk about MOD-SC. Instead, what he talked about was using phenomic markers, phenomic triggers to predict outcomes. And I think it's very interesting. One of the biggest ones he mentioned was that there is a protein which becomes elevated decades, decades before you have a heart attack. And I don't know if anyone knows what that is. So I'll tell you. It's called PCSK9. Well, we have a medicine that actually will inhibit PCSK9, called a PCSK9 inhibitor, and that's Repatha. Now, insurance only pays for Repatha after you've failed using medications like statins, which can have mitochondrial toxicity and prevent our ability to make cofactors we need for energy. So I think that's very interesting. So Dr. Verdin addressed that. He also highlighted something called um, a digital copy of yourself. So what is that? That means to be able to make a high fidelity digital twin. I don't know if you watched the movie Westworld, but in Westworld, in the show on HBO, they were actually trying to do that, create a digital twin. And they couldn't do it with fidelity and it kept crashing. So our key is to understand how can we use the digital twin and how can we use them to make predictions and tweak lifestyle accordingly. And so in addition to Dr. Verdin, the next thing that I think was really important was Dr. Lou's talk. Dr. Lou's talk, as he introduced everything, he went over and followed the deputy mayor, who said that the Palais du Festival has over 150 events each year. And Cannes itself is a city focused on longevity, where 20% of the Côte d'Azur residents are going to be over 80 years old. And in fact, interestingly enough, Côte d'Azur has its own longevity research trial going on, which I think is really interesting. 30,000 residents of Côte d'Azur, which include Cannes, are being researched and monitored for healthy aging. That's important. But what we need to remember here in all the glory of Cannes and all of the affluence is that longevity actually should be a human right. And that's where Dr. Liu's talk, I think, was fantastic. Dr. Liu basically said our biggest threats to lifespan are childhood mortality and war. It appears we are our biggest enemies. We really are. Um, when you look at lifestyle, when you look at our ability to affect great change on our own health, we're the ones hurting it. When you look at the suffering that is caused to humans by humans, we need to look at ourselves. And I think that's so very important. But also, Dr. Liu made a really great mention, which is the following: the longevity docs community are the pioneers in longevity medicine. We literally are the pioneers. And that means we have to work harder and we have to be able to communicate with each other. And we have to understand that we're going to get arrows from those in traditional medicine. And it's just the way that it is. We must be willing to help each other out and sustain each other during these attacks. The next talk that came that I thought was really wonderful was a small group with Naveen Jain, who's a serial entrepreneur and tech wizard, for lack of a better word, and Dr. David Liu, who also is a technology entrepreneur and cardiac surgeon. And what they talked about is the following. You ready? Doctors have never been trained to build companies. So how can we expect doctors to build great companies if we don't train them? And I think one of the most important points from this talk was, if you want to make $1 billion, you need to improve 1 million lives. No physician can do that on his own, that or her own. That is called the cobbler fallacy. Instead, what we need to do is we need to use the tools out there that exist to make people healthy, to make people healthy. We need to get paid based on making health a priority, not on treating disease. And that's a radical transformation for most people here. In addition, in this small group, one of the most important things that Dr. Liu and Naveen Jain talked about was using AI. Use AI to evaluate data. I know there maybe 3,000 articles a day get published. Dr. Verdon confirmed is roughly that sort of thing. We can't read them. So we need to use AI to be able to augment our dietary regimen of medical data and review it, because there's a lot of garbage out there. And so we need to cut that. In addition to this, you need to ask yourself, how are you interacting with yourself daily? What are your thoughts to yourself? We can't control other people. And so this is a very interesting Buddhist tenet, which I tend to stick to, and a Stoic principle. We can only control what we think and what we do to help our own body and to help with our own longevity. And so that's an important thing to go over. The next thing that transpired after this was actually a wonderful talk by my good friend, Betsy Yurth. And so Betsy debuted, sorry, I'm moving a little bit, but my notes are getting blown all over. So Betsy debuted something she called the Phoenix Protocol. And what does that mean? Well, a phoenix burns to ashes every night and rises again every morning. And that really is what our body needs to be doing. And so if anyone knows Dr. Yurth, she, like myself, is a mitochondrial specialist, a mitochondriac that focuses on our mitochondria and how our mitochondria drive our cells. So she went over something called her Phoenix Protocol, which is the following. We need to burn down, we need to put out the fire, and we need to rebuild. And so she went through some of the tools to do that. She talked a little bit about how we burn down, and she mentioned something called mitophagy. So I'm going to freestyle a little bit on mitophagy. What Dr. Yurth talked about was what we call type 2 mitophagy, which happens with damaged mitochondria. She talked about Parkin and PNK1 pathway, which is a type 2 mitophagy pathway for damage. And that's very important. But there's an additional type 1 pathway called autophagy. And fasting induced mitophagy, right? Mitophagy meaning the breakdown of mitochondria. And that is almost entirely dependent on PI3K, just the way that type 2 is almost exclusively dependent on the PINK1 pathway. So she talked about the more pathologic cause. And then she talked a little bit about signaling that rebirth through the NERF1 and NERF2. And what we realize is that we are going to rebuild mitochondria all the time. Every 10 to 20 days, we get new rounds of mitochondria, similar to how we get new rounds of platelets. And I think that's very important to understand. We know that we can induce some of these events by fasting, by reducing our energy. We can activate our rebuilding process. First burn, put out the fire, and then reburn. And one of the ways to do that is to really look at an antioxidant profile and use things like exogenous ketones. And in fact, one of the things Dr. Ure talked about was using 20 grams of ketones every 4 hours to eat to help cool down the flames. She also made mention a little bit, and I wrote a little bit of this in my book on GLP-1s. And Dr. Kuo is going to talk about this in the afternoon, which is GLP-1s restoring cell membranes, reducing inflammation, and actually serving as a longevity drug. And so we're excited to study that. In addition, if you're going to build new cell membranes, you need to use things like plasmalogens. You need to use omega 3s, omega 6s, and omega 9s in a proper ratio. I love omega 3s, but guess what? You can't just use them on your own. You have to have a ratio. Lastly, Dr. Yurth talked about using peptides. Now, her and I both agree that peptides are great, but they're often overhyped. And peptides really, you don't want to use them. They're very much like hyperbaric oxygen. You don't want to use them until you have all of the tools in place to repair and rebuild your mitochondria. And that's essential. The next talk after that, holy cow, is with my good friends, Dr. E, um, with Dr. Rose, with Dr. Joseph Raffaelli, and it was moderated by Anna, who I met last night at dinner. And what I have to tell you is the following. No one biomarker strategy is going to be the best biomarker strategy. We sort of know this. But if you look at big picture, can we use some of traditional medicine's biomarkers? Yes. But guess what? A lot of times they're going to fail us because they are meant to track disease, not cellular disease states. And Dr. Raffaelli talked about using immunosenescence biomarkers, which I also actively use in a company called Sapir X, looking at those, what we call the senescence associated secretory phenotype, phenome, and the senescence associated secretory protein package in our immune cells. We can look at our level of cellular senescence, of immunosenescence, which is one of the biggest predictors of aging. Dr. E talked about traditional markers. He also talked about using ApoE as a guide. I know myself, we will do ApoE testing and follow something called the Bredesen protocol for our patients who are predisposed to having dementia, especially ApoE4E4 patients. And we use rapamycin, we'll use ketones and ketone bodies to effectively reduce your risk of having Alzheimer's dementia. Way early, way early. We're talking using these markers 20 years, 30 years before dementia onset is there. Why? Because, like Dr. Verdon said, put simply, there are changes in our body that happen way before the disease happens. And the essence of longevity medicine is tracking these changes without letting the disease happen. And I think most of the most mind-blowing ones in this morning is the PCSK9 story and tracking PCSK9 levels in patients. Because Dr. Verdon said 20 years before a heart attack, this protein climbs. Can you imagine if we could use Repatha 20 years ahead of time to put out the fire to heal the heart blood vessels before we have damage? That's the essence of longevity medicine. So we're now going to go to break, and then we'll have the afternoon, and I'll give you a breakdown of the afternoon when I have that chance. I want to thank everyone that tuned in. I'm going to recap this probably at the end of the night, and I will post it in tidbits that you can dissect right here on the Longevity Insider with Dr. Murphy. For all of you watching, thanks. I know it's early in the States. And to everyone who's going to watch it later, I want you all to focus on your goals to have a life well lived. Talk to you soon.